My name is Jake, and I need to tell you something that's been eating at me for the past 3 years. I used to work at a call center called Global Connect Solutions, and what I witnessed there, well, let's just say there's a reason I can't sleep through the night anymore. I'm sharing this because people deserve to know what really goes on behind those cheerful customer service voices, and maybe, just maybe, someone will believe me. I started working at Global Connect in January 2021, right in the middle of the pandemic when jobs were scarce, and I was desperate. The building was this massive concrete structure on the outskirts of town, surrounded by empty parking lots and chain-link fences. From the outside, it looked like any other corporate facility, but the moment you walked through those glass doors, something felt wrong. The air was too cold, the lights were too bright, and there was this constant humming sound that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The interview process was strange. I sat in a windowless room with a woman named Patricia who never smiled, not once during our entire conversation. She asked me the usual questions about customer service experience and handling difficult situations. But then she asked something that made my skin crawl. How do you feel about making sacrifices for the greater good of the company? I should have walked out right then. But I needed the job. Training lasted 2 weeks, and that's when I first noticed the cameras. They were everywhere, tiny black domes embedded in the ceiling tiles, watching every move we made. Our trainer, a hollow-eyed man named Dennis, explained that they were for quality assurance and employee safety, but the way he said it made my stomach turn. He also mentioned something called the program that we'd learn about once we were ready. I asked what he meant, but he just gave me this dead stare and moved on to the next topic. The call center floor was a maze of identical gray, cubicles stretching as far as the eye could see. Hundreds of agents sat hunched over their computers, speaking in monotone voices that all sounded eerily similar. What struck me most was how quiet it was between calls, no chatter, no laughter, just the soft clicking of keyboards and that ever-present humming sound. My cubicle was in Section D, row 47, seat 23. I remember the exact location because they made us memorize it on our first day. Your location is your identity, Patricia had said during orientation. Never forget where you belong. The cubicle next to mine was occupied by a woman named Lisa who had been there for 3 years. She was thin, almost skeletal, with dark circles under her eyes that looked like bruises. When I introduced myself, she just nodded and whispered, "Don't ask questions. Just do your job and go home." The calls themselves were normal at first, billing inquiries, technical support, the usual customer service stuff. But after my second week, things started getting weird. I began receiving calls that weren't in our system. The caller ID would show up as UNCOWNN, or sometimes just a string of numbers that didn't make sense. These callers would ask strange questions, like, "What's your employee ID number?" or "How many cameras can you see from your desk?" When I tried to ask my supervisor about these calls, she just told me to handle them, according to protocol. But no one had ever told me what that protocol was. Then there were the midnight shifts. Every employee was required to work at least 2 midnight shifts per month. But here's the thing, the building was supposed to close at 10 p.m. Our customer service was advertised as 6 a.m. to 10 p.m. only. So what were we doing there in the middle of the night? The supervisors called them special projects, but they never explained what that meant. During my first midnight shift, I discovered that the entire atmosphere of the building changed after hours. The fluorescent lights were dimmed to an eerie amber glow, and that humming sound became louder, almost like it was coming from inside the walls. But the most disturbing thing was the calls. Instead of regular customers, we received calls from people who sounded wrong. Their voices were flat, emotionless, and they all asked variations of the same questions. Are you watching? Do you see them? How many are left? I tried to document these strange calls, but every time I made notes in our system, they would disappear by the next day. My computer would show no record of the calls ever happening. When I mentioned this to Lisa, She grabbed my arm so hard it left bruises and whispered, "Stop looking. Stop asking. They're always listening." That's when I started noticing the other employees more carefully. There were about 30 people who worked exclusively midnight shifts, and they all had this same hollow look in their eyes. They moved like sleepwalkers, speaking only when necessary. And they all wore these small silver pins on their lanyards that I'd never seen before. When I asked Dennis about the pins during training, he said they were recognition awards for dedicated employees. But something about the way he said it made my blood run cold. The breakthrough came during my 6th week on the job. I was working a midnight shift when my computer glitched, and for about 30 seconds, I could see into another employee's screen. What I saw made me physically sick. She was looking at detailed files on customers, not their billing information or service records, but personal data. Photos of their homes, their daily routines, their family members, even their social media activity. The files were labeled with codes like PIO-RIET and Inhen Seed Monitari Bio. I quickly looked away and pretended nothing had happened. But I couldn't get those images out of my head. That night, I started paying attention to what my coworkers were actually doing during calls. Most of them weren't providing customer service at all. They were typing notes into a completely different system, one I'd never seen before. The next day, I decided to do some investigating. During my lunch break, I wandered into parts of the building I'd never been to before. On the 3rd floor, I found a room with no windows and a door marked AUS Rise Personnel ONLY. Through the crack under the door, I could see the glow of multiple computer screens and hear the soft murmur of voices. I pressed my ear to the door and nearly jumped out of my skin when I heard my own name being discussed. Jake Thompson, Section D, Row 47. Seat 23, a woman's voice was saying, 6 weeks in, shows signs of curiosity, recommend immediate enrollment in the program. Another voice, male this time, responded, agreed. Schedule him for weekend orientation. Use Protocol 7 if he resists. I backed away from the door as quietly as I could and returned to my desk. My heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I spent the rest of my shift pretending to take normal customer service calls while my mind raced with questions. What was the program? What was Protocol 7? And why were they talking about me? That weekend, I received a call at home from Patricia. "Jake, we need you to come in tomorrow for some additional training. It's mandatory for all employees after their 6th week." Her voice had that same dead quality I'd noticed in the midnight shift workers. When I asked what kind of training, she simply said, "You'll understand everything soon enough." I didn't sleep that night. Something deep in my gut told me that if I went to that training session, I wouldn't come back the same person. I'd seen what happened to the midnight shift workers. They all had that same empty look, like their souls had been scooped out and replaced with something else. Instead of going to the training, I called in sick and spent the day researching Global Connect solutions online. What I found was terrifying. The company had dozens of locations across the country, but there were virtually no reviews from employees on job sites. The few reviews that existed were all identical, word for word, as if they'd been written by the same person. Even more disturbing, I found missing person reports from family members looking for relatives who had worked at various Global Connect locations. The reports all had the same pattern. The employees had started acting strangely, then gradually lost contact with their families before disappearing entirely. I also discovered that Global Connect wasn't just a customer service company. Hidden in their corporate filings were references to behavioral research, psychological profiling, and something called social compliance testing. They were contracted by organizations I'd never heard of, with names that sounded more like government agencies than private companies. The more I dug, the more disturbing details I uncovered. There were patent applications filed by Global Connect for something called neural pattern recognition software and behavioral modification through audio frequency manipulation. I didn't understand the technical jargon, But the implications were clear. They were using technology to alter people's behavior through sound. That humming in the walls wasn't just ventilation or electrical systems. It was something much more sinister. I also found financial records showing payments from Global Connect to psychiatric facilities and research hospitals. Millions of dollars changing hands with no clear explanation for what services were being provided. But the most chilling discovery was a leaked internal memo from 2019 that I found buried in an obscure whistleblower forum. The memo discussed Phase 3 implementation and mentioned satisfactory conditioning results in 89% of test subjects. It talked about expanding operations to rural and suburban markets and achieving full integration within 24 months. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Lisa's hollow face and hear that mechanical humming sound. I kept thinking about all the coworkers I'd left behind, wondering if they were already lost or if there was still time to save them. But deep down, I knew the truth. Anyone still working there was either complicit or already transformed into something else. The next morning brought a new horror. I was checking my email when I found a message that made my blood freeze. It was from my old company email account, the one I'd never accessed since quitting. The subject line read, "Outstanding training requirements." The message was brief. "Dear Jake, our records indicate you have not completed your mandatory Phase 2 orientation. Please report to Building C, Room 347 within 72 hours to avoid disciplinary action. Failure to comply will result in immediate implementation of Protocol 7. Regards, Human Resources Department, Building C." I'd never heard of a Building C during my time there. The entire facility was supposedly contained in one large structure. But as I thought back to my last day of surveillance, I remembered seeing construction vehicles behind the main building. They'd been expanding, building something new while I was still working there. I tried to dismiss the email as an automated system glitch. But then I noticed something that made me physically sick. The email was sent at 3:33 a.m., exactly the time I'd been waking up every night since quitting. Drenched in sweat and hearing that damn humming sound, it couldn't be a coincidence. Over the next few days, I started noticing things that confirmed my worst fears. While running errands around town, I began recognizing voices I'd heard during my midnight shifts at Global Connect. The cashier at the grocery store, the receptionist at my doctor's office, even the drive-through worker at the coffee shop I frequented. They all had that same flat, emotionless tone I remembered from my former co-workers. But it wasn't just their voices that bothered me. It was their questions. The grocery store cashier asked if I lived alone. The doctor's receptionist wanted to know about my work schedule. The coffee shop worker inquired about my daily routine. Individually, these might have seemed like normal small talk, but taken together, they formed a pattern of information gathering that made my skin crawl. I decided to test my theory. I started giving different answers to each person, creating fictional details about my life to see what would happen. I told the grocery clerk I worked night shifts. I told the doctor's office I lived with roommates. I told the coffee shop I was unemployed. Within a week, I noticed these lies being reflected back to me in subtle ways. The grocery store started playing different background music. During my visits, something with a low, droning frequency that made me feel agitated. The doctor's office began scheduling my appointments during times I'd claimed to be working. The coffee shop started offering me discounts on drinks I'd never ordered but had mentioned, preferring. During our fake conversations, they were testing me, seeing how malleable I was to their influence. But more than that, they were building a psychological profile, trying to find the best way to manipulate me into compliance. I realized that my escape from Global Connect hadn't been as clean as I'd thought. They were still watching, still trying to reel me back in through this network of converted employees scattered throughout the community. That's when I discovered the true scope of their operation. During one of my sleepless nights, I decided to drive around the city, looking for other Global Connect facilities. What I found was far worse than I'd imagined. They didn't just have one building, they had dozens. Small, unmarked offices scattered throughout residential areas, each one disguised as something innocent. A tax preparation service here, a telemarketing company there, even a non-profit organization claiming to help veterans find employment. But they all had the same characteristics: no windows facing the street, excessive security cameras, and that same concrete and steel architecture I remembered from the main facility. Most disturbing of all, they all had the same construction company's signs posted outside, even though the buildings looked like they'd been there for years. I started mapping these locations, and a terrifying pattern emerged. They were strategically placed to cover maximum population density, with each facility responsible for monitoring and influencing a specific geographic area. The main building where I'd worked wasn't their headquarters. It was just one node in a vast network designed to infiltrate and control entire communities. The breakthrough came when I decided to follow one of the employees from a smaller facility. I picked a woman who worked at what appeared to be a medical billing company, but which I suspected was actually another global Connect operation. I followed her for 3 days, documenting her routine and the people she interacted with. What I discovered changed everything I thought I knew about their operation. This woman, I'll call her Janet, wasn't just gathering information on random targets. She was specifically focused on people in positions of influence: city council members, school board officials, local business owners, even police officers. She would engage them in seemingly innocent conversations, always asking questions about their schedules, their concerns, their decision-making processes. But the most chilling part was what happened after these conversations. Within days, these influential people would start making decisions that seemed completely out of character. A city council member who'd been fighting against corporate development suddenly voted to approve a massive new business complex. A school board official who'd been advocating for increased arts funding switched to supporting budget cuts. A police chief who'd been cracking down on white-collar crime suddenly redirected resources toward minor drug offenses. They weren't just collecting information, they were actively manipulating the decision-makers in the community, steering policy and resource allocation in directions that benefited their mysterious agenda. And they were doing it through a combination of psychological profiling, behavioral conditioning, and that audio frequency manipulation I'd read about in their patents. I realized that the midnight shifts I'd worked weren't about customer service at all. Those strange calls we received were actually conditioning sessions, designed to program us into becoming more effective manipulators. The questions we were asked to record: are you watching? Do you see them? How many are left? Were probably trigger phrases designed to activate specific responses in people who'd been exposed to their audio conditioning. The employees who worked exclusively midnight shifts weren't just gathering intelligence, they were the fully programmed operatives. The ones who'd been completely transformed by the program. They were deployed throughout the community to identify targets, gather information, and execute the psychological manipulation campaigns designed by their handlers. As I pieced together more of their operation, I began to understand why they'd been so interested in recruiting me. My background in psychology, which I'd mentioned during my interview, made me a valuable asset for their behavioral modification programs. They probably planned to use me to develop more effective manipulation techniques, or to train other operatives in psychological warfare tactics. But there was something else, something that made me realize the true scope of what I'd stumbled into. While researching Global Connect's corporate structure, I found connections to dozens of other companies, all seemingly unrelated but all sharing the same mysterious funding sources and executive leadership. There were security firms, data analysis companies, political consulting groups, even media organizations. It wasn't just a call center operation, it was a shadow network designed to influence and control society at multiple levels. They were using their call centers as recruitment and training facilities, their customer service operations as intelligence-gathering platforms, and their network of converted employees as a distributed manipulation apparatus. The most terrifying realization was that this network had been growing for years, probably decades. The patents I'd found dated back to the early 2000s, and there were references to preliminary trials that went back even further. They'd been perfecting their techniques for a generation, slowly expanding their influence and refining their methods. I started having panic attacks thinking about how many people might already be under their influence. How many customer service representatives had been through their conditioning programs? How many seemingly normal employees scattered throughout the country were actually programmed operatives, gathering intelligence and manipulating their communities according to some master plan? The scope of it was overwhelming. But what truly broke me was the personal realization that came next. I started thinking about my own behavior since leaving Global Connect, and I noticed disturbing patterns. The route I took when driving around the city wasn't random. I was unconsciously visiting the locations where I suspected they had facilities. The questions I asked when testing employees at various businesses weren't just investigative, they followed the same pattern of information gathering I'd been trained to use during my brief time at Global Connect. Even my decision to research and expose their operation might not have been entirely my own. What if my escape had been planned all along? What if I was supposed to discover these things, supposed to spread this information as part of some larger psychological operation designed to create fear and paranoia in the general population? The doubt consumed me. I couldn't trust my own thoughts and motivations anymore. Every decision I made, every instinct I followed, could have been planted there during my time at the facility. The humming sound I heard at night might not be a hallucination or a residual effect of their conditioning. It might be an active signal, continuing to influence my behavior even now. That's when I realized the true horror of what Global Connect had created. It wasn't just about controlling individuals or even communities. It was about undermining the very concept of free will, creating a world where no one could be certain whether their thoughts and actions were truly their own. I spent weeks trying to develop some kind of test to determine if I was still under their influence. But how do you verify the authenticity of your own consciousness? How do you know if your desire for freedom is genuine or just another layer of programming designed to serve their agenda? The uncertainty drove me to the edge of madness. I stopped eating regularly, stopped sleeping, stopped trusting anyone I encountered. Every person could be one of their operatives. Every conversation could be part of their data collection. Every decision I made could be steering me towards some predetermined outcome. But eventually, I realized that the uncertainty itself might be the point. Maybe the goal wasn't to control everyone directly, but to create enough doubt and paranoia that people would become paralyzed by indecision, unable to take meaningful action against the system. A population that couldn't trust their own thoughts would be far easier to manipulate than one that had to be individually programmed. That realization gave me the strength to write this account, even knowing it might be exactly what they want me to do. Because the alternative, remaining silent and allowing their network to continue growing unchecked, is far worse than the possibility that I'm playing into their hands. If you're reading this, you need to understand that the threat is real and it's everywhere. Every call center, every customer service interaction, every seemingly innocent conversation with service employees could be part of their intelligence gathering operation. They're not just collecting data on your purchasing habits or service preferences. They're building psychological profiles designed to identify your vulnerabilities and exploit them for their own purposes. Monday morning, I didn't go to work. Instead, I drove to the building and watched from across the street. What I saw confirmed my worst fears. Employees were entering the building, but they all moved with that same robotic precision I'd noticed in the midnight shift workers. Their faces were blank, their movements mechanical, It was like watching a hive of insects rather than human beings going to work. That's when I saw Lisa. She was walking toward the employee entrance, but something was wrong with her gait. She moved too stiffly, like someone who was learning to walk for the first time. But the most horrifying thing was her face. It was completely expressionless, like a mask. This was the same woman who just weeks earlier had warned me to stop asking questions. Now she looked like she'd been lobotomized. I never went back to Global Connect Solutions. I packed up my apartment that day and moved 3 states away. But even now, 3 years later, I still get phone calls in the middle of the night. The caller ID always shows my old employee number, and when I answer, there's just that familiar humming sound, the same one that came from the walls of the building. I've tried to report what I witnessed to the authorities, but every time I mention Global Connect Solutions, I get transferred to different departments until eventually the line goes dead. I've reached out to journalists, but they either don't respond or tell me they can't find any record of the company existing. It's like they've been wiped from public records. But I know they're still out there. Sometimes I'll be in a store or restaurant and I'll hear that familiar hollow tone in a customer service representative's voice. And I'll know they've been through the program. They're everywhere now, these empty shells that used to be people, all connected to something larger and more sinister than any of us can imagine. The worst part is the knowledge that I was supposed to be one of them. If I had gone to that weekend training session, I would have become another mindless drone in their operation. Whatever they're doing at these call centers, it's not customer service, it's something far more horrifying. They're harvesting people, turning them into tools for some purpose I can't even begin to understand. I'm sharing this story because I need people to know the truth. If you know someone who works at a call center and they start acting strangely, if they become distant, emotionless, if they stop being themselves, please try to get them away from that place. Don't let them go to any special training or additional orientation. And whatever you do, don't trust the authorities if they try to tell you everything is normal. The last thing I'll tell you is this: if you ever call customer service and the representative asks you questions that seem unrelated to your issue, hang up immediately. If they want to know about your daily routine, your family, your address, anything personal, just hang up. Because they're not trying to help you with your cable bill or your insurance claim. They're gathering information for something much darker. I still have nightmares about that building, about the humming in the walls and the empty eyes of my former coworkers. But mostly, I have nightmares about Lisa and how she looked that last day, like a puppet with its strings being pulled by something inhuman. That's what they wanted to do to me. And that's what they're doing to countless others right now, in buildings just like Global Connect Solutions, all across the country. The next time you call customer service, remember that the person on the other end might not be a person at all anymore. They might be something else entirely. Something that used to be human, but got fed into a machine that strips away everything that makes us who we are. And if you work in a call center yourself, and you start noticing things that don't make sense, trust your instincts. Get out before it's too late. Because once they put you through the program, there's no coming back. You become part of their network, another node in whatever twisted operation they're running. I'm Jake Thompson, and this is my warning to the world. They're out there, they're growing, and they won't stop until they've turned us all into hollow shells, serving their incomprehensible purpose. Don't let them take you. Don't let them take anyone you care about. Because hell isn't a place you go when you die. Sometimes, hell is a job you apply for when you're desperate, and by the time you realize what you've walked into, it's already too late to escape.